So, that layout on a vacation project? It's been on my mind a lot, in part for reasons that you'll see soon enough, but also because, yeah, On30 was way too big for that. I am not bringing it again. But something smaller could work, right? In fact, I already mentioned this idea. Let's just play some clips from a previous video for context. Trains, why don't I do N-gauge, but with a bigger scale, like, say, HON30 or ON18, right? It would be a great... Now, I won't recap everything, but here's a basic summary of why this wouldn't work at the time. You see, I don't have any HON30, I don't have any ON18, and this creates two issues. First of all, I would have to wait about a week for it to get shipped here, and then I would also have to worry about painting it all in a week and editing a video for it all in a week. Even if I could ignore the shipping time, I cannot ignore the costs. I'm strapped for cash right now. My phone broke, my headphones broke, I had to buy replacements for both of those. I've got the vacation. So, why is ON18 fine all of a sudden? Well, the answer is simple. I don't have the time limit anymore, and I can somewhat afford it in smaller doses now. And I also just feel in the mood. To start this project, we spray painted the parts with primer and the main engine shell in black. For the kit, I went with an engine from JT's Trains and Things. They're an eBay seller who offers a lot of ON30, HON30, and ON18 3D printed kits. They require assembly and usually couplers and trucks, but are sold at a good price and have okay detail. And as I edit this video, they have some old stock from Shapeways, and it's marked down big time. There's not much left anymore, but I was able to snag a tank engine shell through this sale. I think the Shapeways stuff is marked down so much because JT recently acquired a resin 3D printer, which, in my opinion, has finer detail than the Shapeways stuff. But it also seems that JT updated the prints on the tank engines to have some extra detail that the original designs did not have. For example, this water hatch instead of a sand dome. That'll be relevant in a little bit. Now, to make the engine run, you have to buy a mechanism separately, but I already had one, actually. Before I even started doing models on YouTube, probably about 6 years ago, goodness gracious, my father bought a Kato pocket line mechanism for an N-scale trolley project using a Shapeways 3D print. Now, sadly, we broke the print during assembly, so this mechanism never really found a home. At least, until now. JT's kits are designed for these mechanisms. The last thing I needed to worry about buying was some extra detail parts, such as a headlight or a whistle. Since I already needed to order some of those for the Halloween train, I just threw in a couple of extra parts for this in my orders. For example, this Wiseman Model Services headlight enclosure. Speaking of which, you might have already noticed, but I had to drill out a slightly larger hole in the enclosure so we could fit an LED in there. My father had a couple of spare LEDs he was willing to let me just steal. The drill I used was slightly too small for the LED, but that just gave everything enough pressure to hold itself together. I then drilled some holes to let the wires run to the interior of the engine. Now, I did this just to get the wires closer to the pickups on the mechanism, but it actually wound up serving double duty as it held the LED and enclosure in place quite well due to the stiffness of the wire. With that done, I really should have painted the headlight enclosure, but instead I decided to assemble the frame. Priorities, I guess. Now, the frame that this comes with is kind of like a tram's skirting that goes around and hides the wheels. Obviously, it's cooler to see the driving rods in motion, but the mechanism we're using is supposed to be for an electric engine, not a steam one, so there are no driving rods and the wheels don't exactly look right. The frame is included to disguise this fact, and it also includes some fake pistons just to really sell that this is a steam engine. It didn't take long to assemble this, though, as all it required was a little bit of superglue and trimming down the mechanism's frame so that it would fit between the skirting. Once the glue had dried, I figured it was time to paint over the frame with something more than just primer. So, I used a little bit of Badger Model Flex Weathered Black, which was a slightly darker gray than the primer I was using. For the pistons, however, I went with the same black as the main body of the locomotive, just to highlight that the pistons were actually there, in case anyone asked if it was a real steam engine. You know, gotta sell the magic trick somehow. For the whistle, I had a spare Cumberland Shops one laying around. To get it into place, I just drilled a hole into the steam dome. With the whistle test fit, and my mind on the top of the tank, I realized that the water tank had no water hatch, like I mentioned before, and that the sand dome was a little bit pointless. So I filed down the sand dome to make it fairly flat. After cleaning up the damaged paint from the filing, I cut some very small strips of styrene, which I measured and cut by eye. I tried supergluing them down to the new water hatch, but the glue that I used was a little bit too floaty, and the strips wound up falling off the engine as I tried moving them back into position. That was an annoying mess to clean up, and left a couple of modeler's scars. While waiting for the superglue to dry so I could try assembling the water hatch again, I decided to paint the cab roof in weathered black just to give the engine a little more color. Well, if you can even call this color. I also glued on the engine's skirting to the shell, at first trying canopy glue, but eventually realizing that wasn't enough and just using superglue. I also spent a little bit of time using some canopy glue to add coal to the fuel bunker. Once the superglue mess had dried up, I got back to work on the water hatch. This time, I used canopy glue, which had a much better consistency and gave me more time to adjust the strips before the glue dried. The strips are supposed to represent hinges, but we also need a handle so there's actually a way to lift open the water hatch. So I took some wire and bent it into shape. Now, I didn't do a great job of consistently bending it, and the holes that I drilled for the handle to fit into were kind of misaligned, but I think that adds a little bit of charm to the locomotive. Is it realistic? No. Is it cute? Yeah. Is anybody gonna notice? Nope. Once the glue had settled once again, I got to painting. At first, I went with the same black as the boiler, but I eventually changed my mind and went with weathered black again to highlight the detail. The headlight enclosure also wound up the same way. At first, I painted it with the boiler black, but eventually changed my mind and went for weathered black instead. The engine is starting to look pretty complete, but I think one point that needs to change is the whistle. It definitely needs to be a color other than black. I started with a coat of Ceramcoat Empire Gold, and then I followed it up with a second coat of Citadel Color Balor Brown. This made for a decently convincing color. While I do like this engine being mostly black and gray, I think a little more color is necessary, so let's add some weathering. Some dark brown pan pastels on the skirting helped to represent some dirt stains from being kicked up as the train ran along the tracks. Some lighter brownish orange around the water hatch represents rust from water overflowing from the tank or missing the hatch as the tank is being filled. And of course, a little bit of light gray represents steam stains on the steam dome and the smoke box. Visually, she's complete, but operationally, we did do a little work off camera. My father wired in the headlight, and for some reason, I didn't even bother taking pictures. We had to add some insulation so wires didn't cross, and we had to add a resistor so the LED wasn't getting too much power and becoming the literal sun, But with that, honestly, I think I've made a mistake. I didn't buy anything for this to pull, and I really should have. Despite the basic paint job, this is an adorable little critter, and I think it deserves a little more than just a loop of track to run on. I could totally see this pulling like 3 ore jimmies filled to the rim with copper and a boxcar and a caboose, or something like that. Someday, I hope to set this up on my desk as a little way to appease my ADHD. And with it running on a 4.6-inch radius in the footage here, I will certainly have the space. For now, though, that's all I have today. Thank you for tuning in. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. Cheers, folks.